Please welcome from Koddi, President and co-founder Nicholas Ward, in discussion with SkiftX research editor Jeremy Kressmann.
All right. So in this session, we're going to talk about a new era in advertising and travel, one in which digital ad techniques actually give marketers the power to continuously optimize and refine campaigns in real time. I think this is without a question an improvement, but I think it also creates new challenges for marketers as there's more complexity to manage. There's all kinds of questions for that, right? How do you orchestrate the right mix of distribution channels to optimize for things like revenue, occupancy? What strategy should you use to pick the right ad formats and technologies? And how do you build a team and a culture that's fluent in this new data-driven approach? So I have Nicholas from Koddi here. He knows quite a bit about travel advertising. Talk about a few questions here. Nicholas, why don't you give me the lay of the land from your leadership position at Koddi? What does travel industry marketing look like now, and what has been changing in recent years?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. Really excited to be here. Lay of the land, it's a big question. I think the best way that I can think about it is this, which is that put yourself in the shoes of a VP marketing, CMO, CDO, head of e-commerce at a big travel brand. Think about how you spent the last maybe decade of your career, which is really building towards this world of right message, right user, right time. It's this played out trope, I think, in some ways, but it works, and it's what everybody's really been working towards. So you've built the infrastructure, you've built the team, you've built the analytics capabilities, you've built all the expertise in-house. You've probably gone through a lot of pain to be able to get there. It's like now you can actually start to do some of the work that you've been planning to do. But you're also facing this really big consumer change. You're starting to face new questions around privacy. The way that you are able to market is totally different than it's ever been in the past. And I think looking forward, a lot of big advertisers are seeing things like their behavioral campaigns, their targeting, their segmentation. These things are in question because of all of these new trends that are popping up from a user perspective. And so our approach to that is to appreciate that problem, number one, and say, this is something that's out there, and it's going to change how we're driving revenue and growing the business. And number two, to be able to focus on what assets do we have that we own that we can actually start to do some really, really interesting things with from a marketing perspective, and grow revenue and really focus on driving more profit from some of those new capabilities.
So why don't we zero into one particular sector for a second? You think about hotels, they have this very complicated balancing act, right? They're trying to balance between where do I distribute my inventory, how do I hit the right occupancy rates, how do I hit the right revenue management targets? From your position, how are we now seeing the strategy to try and manage some of these different disciplines? Like, what is the balance there?
Yeah, so I think from our seat, it's probably the most interesting time and fun time to be facing this problem as a hotel or a brand. And I think this is true for travel brands outside of hotels as well. But it's like all of these things that we have always believed to be true about the connectedness and the connectivity between things like your occupancy and your business performance and your revenue management and the back-end systems that you have in your distribution and pricing and everything that goes into that.
Right.
It's exactly as connected as everybody's always believed. Now we actually have the ability to bring in that data. And I think one of the things that people are finding advertisers are coming up against time and time again is that not only is it exactly as connected, but it's way more complicated to be able to do anything about it now that you actually start to be able to have some of the tools to be able to do something about it.
Right, and figuring out like when one moves up and the other moves down and the third one is involved, how do you strike the right balance between those?
Yeah, so I think the case that I talk about a lot with clients, and it's a really smart thing to do, but part of our platform capability is to be able to run and adjust your marketing based off of property level occupancy by specific dates and even down into more levels of granularity. And so what's super interesting about this is we always started out with a study because we have to understand how does occupancy for a given hotel in a given context affect your ability to drive revenue for it. And one of the things that we consistently find is that high occupancy is correlated with a high conversion rate. And so when you're doing your advertising and your marketing, that's really helpful to know because it helps you understand where to put your dollars. And it's also not, it makes a lot of sense. It's something that's very intuitive. The hotel is high occupancy for a reason, probably the same reason it's high conversion rate. But what is really interesting is what happens next, which is, okay, I have $100 to spend, 2 hotels, one's 95% occupancy, one's 70% occupancy. Where do I put those dollars? Well, on one hand, the data says, let's put it towards 95% occupancy because I'm going to get the best dollar out.
Intuitively.
Exactly. Yep. But then in the case of the 70% occupancy hotel, do they maybe need that booking more? What's the additional context that starts to come into play from that perspective? And so we start to get into these really interesting conversations and these really interesting kind of data problems where it's like, do we want more profit, right? Do we want more top line revenue? Or do we want to make the dollars work a little bit harder in terms of maybe driving new business to a property that wouldn't have otherwise seen it?
Yeah.
But the outcome of that is actually is quite positive, which is that you're understanding the business better because you're asking these really smart questions about it that you probably had thought about before, but now you're actually being struck with A or B, like which decision do I make? And that can be tough.
So tell me about automation technology. And again, this is a very broad term.
Yeah.
People talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence. How does that play into the optimization process that we're describing here? Does it help with that? Like, how does it work?
It's crucial to it. So that scenario that I talked about, that 95% occupancy. So you think about 95% occupancy, but that's for one day, right? So you think one hotel, 365 days into the year. That's a lot of data points. Add on 7 night stays, 14 night stays, that whole spread from that perspective. Then think about, I have different room types, I have different rate plans. I have all kinds of different levels of distribution that I'm thinking about. I have the ability to market those things differently. I have to predict what happens in every single one of those channels. We kind of take it through, and even if you start with that one hotel and go through all the numbers that I talked about and add on a couple of others, you end up with something like 43 billion different potential outcomes.
Wow.
For one hotel, right? So think about now that problem compounded across thousands of hotels, changing portfolios, things like that. Automation is the only way to be able to deal with that level of scale that ultimately you need to be able to start to play on those decisions once you start to really understand the data that goes into it.
Well, and as you begin to embrace this automation you're describing too, it changes your strategic thinking about how to decide to make business decisions, right? You know, we talked about this idea of like a prediction versus a model.
Yeah.
Can you explain that difference and why it's so important?
Yeah, so I think the way that we think about it is that a model is really just the simplification of the challenging problem that you're trying to deal with, right? So you take something that's really dynamic like that 43 billion combination example that I talked about. The model starts to allow you to change and tweak different things that ultimately go into that. Your prediction can be the input and the output in some cases. And by that I mean, we'll make a prediction based off of a forecast of what we expect to happen. And usually those things are pretty good. It runs through the model, the output happens, the outcome ultimately happens. But what that can ultimately then give you is how good was your original prediction? Because that's really, really valuable for being able to determine how effective am I going to be in terms of deploying a given strategy, especially from the automation side. And the real magic comes from when you start to create the right kind of feedback loop so that your model and your predictions both become better and better and better over time. Not only does it lead to just better results, but it also helps you start to discover new things about the business. Some of those questions that I talked about before, your outcomes will actually spark and start to create. And there's a lot of counterintuitive things that ultimately come out of that.
Okay, so there's counterintuitive insights that come out of this process. What are some of those counterintuitive insights? What wouldn't you expect?
Yeah, the two biggest ones. The first is, if you think about the hotel business specifically and the focus on direct bookings versus indirect bookings, right? Am I going to get on-site or through an OTA?
Big discussion, obviously.
Huge discussion, right? And so one of the things that we've been able to prove through the systems that we create is that you actually have to think about, like, what's the thing that I want to accomplish? Because sometimes I want that indirect booking because it's more accretive to the business than the direct booking. And so what we focus on is building the foundation. The data becomes the fuel to be able to make those good decisions. The second scenario that comes up quite frequently is that you run into these unexpected outcomes that you just wouldn't run into otherwise. So like we focus primarily on the meta space, and so the channels that we start to operate in, when we're given a challenge like, hey, we need to drive 200 bookings in this time period before the end of month to be able to hit some objective. Well, being primarily meta shop, and that being where we really started to optimize clients' businesses, you would think that we primarily focus on that as a recommendation. But a lot of times our models will ultimately say, you know what, we can achieve that kind of on accident, even though we can optimize much better in the meta search channel or on Google Hotel Ads, for instance. Maybe there's a better channel for us to be able to get it through because it's so efficient. Now we actually know that we'll get those bookings that we want to be able to drive. And so we'll put the dollars into a totally unexpected place as a result of that and drive better results at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nicholas, this is such an interesting topic. We could talk all day, but unfortunately we have to end it there. So thank you so much.
Very good. All right. Thanks for having me.